Hey everybody, I'm your guide, and this is the 13th entry in a series of more than 150 entries where we'll look at the fascinating and often frightening monsters inscribed in our trusty monster manual. But for now, let's dispense with the pleasantries and get into it. Today's entry is all about this amphibious humanoid that we call the Bullywug. What's a Bullywug, you ask? Bullywugs are a primitive race of frog-like creatures found throughout the bogs and marshes of Toril, the self-proclaimed lords of the swamp. You might be inclined to think these creatures are adorable or cute, and I can't blame you in that regard, but these guys tend to be savage and self-destructive. The Bullywug also regularly tamper with forces beyond their understanding, which ends up threatening other beings with their brutish, belligerent ways. Bullywugs generally stand between 5'4" and 6 feet, and weigh around 150 to 240 pounds on average, but I've heard tell that they can grow up to 7 feet and 300 pounds, and you'll be more likely to find these larger ones in positions of power in their society. Their skin is rough and generally pretty tough, with mottled colorations from olive green to yellow, brown, and even gray. The skin itself is chameleon-like and can easily act as camouflage if they remain motionless in their swampy terrain, because the skin will actually shift colors to match its surroundings, making them fairly difficult to spot if you don't know what you're looking for. Also, students, these guys stink, as they carry with them the rancid smell of their swampy environment. And as you can see, the enlarged heads resemble that of a frog with big, bulbous eyes, wide mouths, and a long, flicking tongue. A tongue that can technically speak common, but will generally come out with a thick, sloppy accent. Alright, so first let's touch on the general Bullywug personality. And I won't lie, these guys are the absolute worst, at least in my opinion. Bullywugs are foul inhabitants of the natural world both in smell and company. They're constantly hungry savages, often completely lacking in higher emotions and feelings. Most other species seem to have at least an innate understanding of their impact on their ecosystem, but not the Bullywug. They either don't understand or don't care. It's hard to say which is closer to the truth. They hunt and kill for sport without even a single thought about allowing their ecosystem to recover, and so these guys will regularly and systematically deplete the resources of their own habitats. Rather than fill any ecological niche, these guys' habits made them a disruption and threat to the fragile balance they themselves relied upon. And after exhausting the local food sources, they'll either move on to greener pastures or turn to cannibalism, although some were cannibals by choice. Now, a Bullywug population won't permanently poison the land in the same way an undead population would, but their recklessness will be disastrous for at least a few years. They tend to strip the land bare and leave behind an echo of the ecosystem that used to exist there. However, I don't believe they're completely unaware of their effect on the ecosystem, but I don't think they're intellectually able to process it. Generally, they'll feel as though something is off about their surroundings, but this will present itself in the form of a broad paranoia and the belief that everything is, quote, out to get them, as it were. The Bullywugs are appropriately bullies. Oftentimes, their greatest joy comes from lording over the trespassers in their lands. They truly do believe themselves to be the owners of the swamp and act accordingly. Their warriors attempt to capture intruders rather than simply slaying them. Then they'll drag them before their king or queen and force them to beg for mercy. However, bribes, treasury, and flattery can fairly easily trick the leader into letting its captives go. But not before it tries to impress its new guests with the majesty of its treasure and whatever trinkets or baubles it might have handy. They prize coins, jewels, and other treasures, although as individuals, they lack the same kind of greed and megalomania found in other marauders, like orcs, for example. In exchange, the Bullywug is generally in possession of a crippling inferiority complex, as they often crave the fear or approval of the very same outsiders they so quickly try to capture. So use this to your advantage if you ever encounter these creatures. It might just help you out of a bad situation. And that about covers that, but stay at the end of class if you have any further questions. For now, we're going to move on to the history of these beings, a section I actually found fairly surprising. If we start digging into the history of these creatures, we'll quickly see just how far back it goes. In the Days of Thunder, around the year -33,500 DR, before the appearance of the elves, giants, and yes, even the dragons, the amphibious creator race known as the Batrachi ruled the supercontinent of Maroroboros. The Batrachi at the time worshipped a deity known as Ramenos, a now dormant deity who seemingly existed just to exist. What does that mean? Well, the deity's nickname is the Sleeping God for its perpetual lethargy. The Batrachi reached the height of their civilization around -31,500 DR, but their dominion was threatened by the giants. Towards the end of this conflict, the Batrachi performed a ritual to defeat the giants and released several primordials, including Asgarath, the creator of dragonkind. Unfortunately for the Batrachi, the battle between the gods and the primordials unleashed unimaginable devastation all across Toril. Continent-sized chunks of land fell into the ocean as the seas were rearranged, while earthquakes and fires ravaged the land. Forced to retreat from the fallout, the Batrachi fled to the outer plane of Limbo, which, if you're not familiar with it, is one of the neutral planes in our cosmology. So, why am I telling you all of this about the Batrachi? Well, when they fled to Limbo, not all of them fled. In fact, some of them stayed here on Toril, and over the years, due to breeding with the quote lesser amphibious races, the Batrachi would slowly but surely evolve into what we know today as the Bullywug. It's honestly fascinating. When I learned that the Bullywug was actually a direct descendant of the Batrachi, needless to say, I was pretty surprised. Because I've talked down about these creatures throughout this entire entry, but it's still quite interesting to learn the heights from which this species has fallen, from ruling the entire supercontinent to where they are now. Honestly, students, I've studied a lot of lore in my time, but was never too familiar with the species. Perhaps it's because I've never really liked spending too much time in the marshes and swamps of Toril. Give me a nice, dry forest, or hell, even a desert any day. In any case, let's move on to the next section of the lecture. Let's talk about the makeup of their society. A Bullywug society, with numbers ranging from 10 to 80 members, is savage, primitive, and tribal, as well as one of the most petty-minded and destructive of all humanoid organizations. Yes, though they've learned to cooperate for the sake of mutual survival, murder is still one of two primary avenues for getting ahead. The only caveat being the murder has to be done secretly, since the Bullywugs that thoughtlessly murder their opponents typically end up being executed by the others. So if you're looking to off your political or economical rival, make sure you do it clandestinely. Aside from their gods, Bullywugs only ever show respect to their leaders. Their semi-organized society relies on the principle of might makes right, and as such, they can be considered socially fascist and totalitarian. In fact, absolute authority is vested to a male chieftain who can freely punish, kill, or even eat those lower or weaker than them. And only when the leader has become too old or frail to rule would the next dominant male make a play for power, typically killing the leader and possibly consuming them in the process. This foul aristocracy formed the basis of etiquette in their society. They'll tend to introduce themselves with grand titles while also groveling before their superiors, endlessly competing to win their favor. But notice how I said murder was one of two ways of getting ahead in this society? What's the second one, you might ask? Well, pillaging, of course. The Bullywug absolutely loves hoarding trinkets and magical treasures, despite the lack of actual use in their society. And instead of killing one another, they may also present their leader with golden trinkets to advance as well. And it's for this reason that Bullywugs raid caravans and settlements, obtaining baubles and knickknacks to impress and win over their masters. However, the Bullywug isn't actually known for caring about the trinkets, so over time the baubles will become tarnished in the eyes of their master, which of course motivates them to demand more and more as time goes on. In fact, this is a big reason as to why a local Bullywug population will always have a negative effect on their environment. They're never quite satisfied, enough is never enough, so their communities will keep stripping the land and the surrounding settlements of all valuables until they're forced to move on to greener pastures. But enough of that, let's move on to the religiosity of these creatures. At a glance, you might not think the Bullywug is interested or even capable of religion, but surprisingly, you'd be wrong. Clerics and shamans are actually quite common among the Bullywug, with as many as 10% of those in a community holding that position. However, at least in my opinion, the greater number of clerics among them comes at a cost of their individual quality. They only have access to a few types of spells, with summoning spells being the most culturally favored. In any case, Bullywug religion is not based on their past, at least not in any objectively verifiable way. The only power exclusive to the Bullywug is Ramanos, a god or possibly a primordial of intoxication, rest, and decline. And even so, the Bullywugs have no creation myth involving Ramanos, and even those who followed him don't necessarily have anything more than the shallowest of understandings. Ramanos gives practically no aid, giving no omens or anything unless a Bullywug cleric performs a ritual and specifically asks. Because of this, I've heard a few of my colleagues wonder if Ramanos is dormant, or if he even exists at all. However, aside from Ramanos, Bullywugs are also known to worship other vile entities such as Gonadaur, Dagon, and even the ancient goddess of darkness, Shar. But let's move on to the next section. Let's take a look at their biology. As one might expect, Bullywugs prefer to inhabit dark, dank places isolated far from human beings. Wet locations like damp caves, swamps, or virtually any other warm but shady region with abundant water. Over the years, they grew soft, suction-cupped fingers to allow them better mobility while moving amongst the trees. Naturally, they also have webbed feet to improve their mobility while on the ground in these swampy areas. They routinely have to soak their bodies to keep their skin as moist as possible, doing this around 3 times a day, at least from what we can observe. In fact, if they're unable to moisten their skin, the Bullywug will slowly weaken and eventually die. In regards to reproduction, Bullywugs are not known to bond long term. Females will lay a clutch of 200 or so eggs once yearly, which is typically watched over by the collective tribe, usually found in some sort of breeding pond. But at any rate, let's move on from that and let's cover combat, because if you come across these guys in your travels, there's a pretty high chance it'll end in a fight. So, okay, to no one's surprise, Bullywugs don't actually favor fair fights. But what does that mean practically? The Bullywug is proficient in the construction and usage of nets and snares. They obviously prefer to fight in or near water, and with their camouflage skin, they're surprisingly adept ambushers. They're also generally emboldened by superior numbers and will almost always try to overwhelm the enemy by surrounding them. However, if you can posture or bluff as something of overwhelming power, there's a good chance that they'll simply move on and search for weaker prey. But what about their magic, you might ask? Well, fittingly, the Bullywug will typically summon monsters as the first part of any direct attack, because unsurprisingly, the Bullywugs will reserve their natural methods of defense, i.e., biting and to a lesser extent their claws, for foes that get too close to them, preferring to wield weapons whenever possible. But truthfully, most of them are barely able to wield anything more than a simple stone weapon or club. You will see them wield spears, though, quite often because it allows them to keep their prey at arm's length. And when it comes to armor, well, it's almost always going to be some crude leather and possibly a shield. But honestly, that's about it regarding combat. Those are the main things I wanted you to know before going out there. They're not exactly the pinnacle of sophistication, but still, don't underestimate them unless you want to find yourself suddenly caught in a net in a local swamp. Which brings us to the end of this entry. I'm not going to lie to you, students, these creatures had a lot more going on than I initially expected. They're still quite basic, generally what one might expect when one sees a small toad-like being in a swamp. However, finding out that they're likely a direct descendant of the ancient Batrachi was a pretty big surprise. I'd also like to look more into this Ramenos figure and see what else I can find. Regardless, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day or night wherever you are. And hit that like and subscribe button if you think I provided you any value or if you learned anything new during this entry. I'll see you guys for the next one, so be safe, take care, and happy trails.